Plato calls it coming out of the cave to see the sun. That's a metaphor. Buddha called it the turning about at the seat of consciousness to find enlightenment. Christ talked about seeing the kingdom of God. Islam, Muhammad talked about, seeing the place of beauty, which is the garden. The ability to see the garden is his metaphor for it. They're all the same thing. They're all pointing to this educational, epistemological revolution that we need to see through lies and deceit. And that's what's happened. That's what Brexit is about. It's this Goebbels-type propaganda campaigning to make us think a lie is true. It won't happen on my watch. and on the watch of any genuine intellectual, any genuine philosopher, or any genuine mystic who's got out of the cave. So that's why I'm proposing this Centre for the Study of Brexit Opposition, to rally the forces of intelligence to see through this propagandistic nonsense. Okay, next question that we need to study then is which academics and political scientists are experts in the study of referenda campaigns? Please get in touch. There aren't that many of us. There is an organisation internationally that studies referenda. They're interesting things. They have their problems, and this is sure one big problem it's caused. And I would like to invite these experts to get involved with this Centre for the Study of Brexit Opposition, because we need their expertise to tell us what to do in cases of an illegal referendum victory like this, and how you can ensure it doesn't happen again. If we're going to have a second referendum, how can we be absolutely sure, in today's internet age and cyber spies and hacking and so on, how can we be sure that it doesn't happen again? Big questions. Next question to ask is, among these experts in international referenda campaigns and so on, has any of them commented on the 2016 referendum? Has there been silence, or have they been jumping up and down saying, this was a cheating victory and needs exposing? There's the International Political Science Association. There's probably a subgroup of that looks at referenda, and I would like to get in touch with them. The British Political Studies Association, again, there will be people that have looked at these things. Some of my colleagues in the Conflict Research Society, again, will have looked at this from the mathematical perspective of modelling. On the whole, referenda are not felt to be helpful in deciding huge questions of policy, and we have a representative government organised in Parliament, and on the whole, it's left to that. So I go back to my question, why was the decision made to circumvent that? And given that it was made, and the consequences have been so horrific, then it seems to me that the only solution is to then have a second referendum. Now, if that, again, is done illegally and people interfere with that, it can't be allowed to stand. There has to be a way of having a fair, honest referenda. Secondly, I think that all people over 16 should also get to vote this time, because that was an error in the first referendum. Something of this significance, which is going to affect the next 50, 100 years of British and European society. Of course, 16-year-olds and over should vote, as they did in the Scottish independence referendum. And also, obviously, UK citizens living abroad, I think, as long as they're UK proper citizens with passports and so on, should also get to vote. And wherever they live, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, France, China, should have the option to vote. There is a question whether it should be mandatory to vote, and I suspend judgment on this. Again, it's something to study, as are all these points, because in some countries, in Australia I believe, when they hold a referendum, it is mandatory to vote. The same in Switzerland. So to get a really conclusive, definitive, this is the result of the will of the people, I suspect mandatory referenda is the way to go. Discuss Okay, next question to ask is, yeah, so obviously in countries like Switzerland, Australia, US, which use referenda and so on, is it mandatory or not? As I say, I think in some countries it is. Also, given that it's regarded as important to reach a certain threshold of the total population in referenda, that again should be implemented for the next referendum. I mean, it should have been for the first one. The first one's result, I think, should be declared null and void for all the reasons that are so apparent. In law, necessarily through the courts, it shouldn't be a political decision, it should be a legal decision. And I think legally it was flawed and illegal. And the way it was interpreted was illegal. The courts should rule out that. If the country then wants a second referendum, it should be done on a legal basis, which is, as I've said, all 16-year-old and above vote. There's a threshold of the percentage of the total population that vote, and possibly it's mandatory. And also there has to be incredibly tight policing about foreign interference, and no money that's undeclared can be involved. And all the people that were involved illegally should be not allowed to participate next time. Now, next question that needs to be studied is, what is the evidence that foreign intelligence organisations or quasi-intelligence agencies or whatever actually interfered with the referendum in 2016? And which countries might those be? And why? Well, this is a big question, and I mean, I'm a political philosopher and a political scientist and peace expert, but it looks to me as if several foreign intelligence organisations may well have been interested in breaking up the UK, which is going to be the result of the imposition of that 2016 fake result, and the damage it's going to do to the European Union. So, which countries are those? Well, there's certainly obvious elements in the USA that are extremely anti-European, anti the European Union, and are not intelligent enough to realise that the UK remaining in the European Union is actually in their interest too, as an international ally and friend. Unfortunately, there's quite a lot of ill-educated or miseducated people in the US, and some of them have risen to great power and prestige. One only has to look at their current president and the cabinet and cronies that surround him. And also at the Dick Cheney, George Bush cabinet that took America into war in 2003 in Iraq against international law. Again, intellectually challenged is a polite way of describing their achievements. Dick Cheney dropped out of his PhD program and, simply didn't have the wisdom, let alone the intellectual ability, to understand that it was not in America's policy interest to do other than find out exactly who had done 9/11. Instead of whipping up a fake Goebbels-type campaign against Iraq. I'm about to publish the second volume of my definitive history of 9/11 from a forensic historical perspective. And I'm calling for an international historical commission of inquiry into 9/11 because the true facts have never come out about that either. And I'm on the job here as philosophers and historians of peace, Secretary General, and it's not good enough. I'm sorry. We cannot allow, as scholars and academics, we cannot allow these pathetic and intellectually challenged politicians to destroy our world or our countries. I love America and I have dear American friends. These people are not worthy of leading that great country, nor are the people in Britain that are imposing Brexit. And we need to find the truth out about 9/11. And I suspect there is a connection between the lack of knowledge and foresight and wisdom that created the 9/11 response of invading Iraq, which was false narrative, with the same team have tried to deliver us Brexit for similar reasons. But they're intellectually challenged, my friends, and we need to expose them. I mean, that's all an area of study. I put all that in brackets and inverted commas, and I say this needs study. I'm starting out with certain hypotheses. We know that Steve Bannon deliberately interfered in these elections. We know that he worked closely with Farage. We know that he was involved in setting up data analytica. We know that he saw Brexit as a military-style operation. We know that he was involved with American military intelligence and that he has a hatred of European Union politics based on miseducation and ignorance. He's never actually realised, what's at stake here, and the extent to which people in Britain have allowed these kind of American semi-educated people to dictate and take over our foreign policy is, I think, scandalous. And questions need to be asked about what on earth was British intelligence doing. Okay, so that's a set of questions. There are sets of questions about Russian interference. And as a scholar and a historian of intelligence, Christopher Andrew and people like this should be consulted, they should be worked with. There are people that know about these things. I think, to me, as a historian of the Cold War and a specialist in Russian Western peace diplomacy, I cannot believe that Russia would have deliberately got involved in pushing a Brexit result with authorization from Putin and co. But I suspend judgment. Let's look at the evidence. And it's possible, Britain and Russia don't have hot friendship going at the moment, tragically. And the same people that have sort of brought us the Cold War seem to want to create Brexit for their own fantasy reasons. Steve Bannon was a Cold War warrior and is extremely Russophobic. So anyway, I suspend judgment. Is there evidence of Russian interference? I hope not. I have many good Russian academic colleagues and friends, and I think they would be appalled if there was. Putin has denied it, and I suspend judgment. I think there's much more likelihood of American involvement in that anti-Brexit thing. I don't think Russia is anti-EU, actually. I know there's been some problems over Ukraine and Crimea, and that needs to be sorted diplomatically, but deep down, Russia and the European Union are potential long-term co-workers towards a common universal peace system. Russia doesn't want a war with Europe, it doesn't want destabilization. It seems to me the Ukrainian chaos and breakdown was again fomented by American intelligence interfering in European affairs, again without any knowledge of the real interests of Europe as a continent. Russia is part of that continent, actually. I would like to see a peace treaty and an economic treaty between the Russian Federation and the European Union and the USA. I think we have to, as the European Union, we have to stand between these two great superpowers and say to them, look, guys, drop all your weapons and your nuclear arsenals. Let's just build peace and let's do trade and let's work out a sort of a civilized world order system in which people's democratic rights are not trampled on and their cultural and religious and intellectual rights are not trampled on either. And instead of a dumbing down that war brings, we need a levelling up. And the International Humanist and Ethical Union, for example, is campaigning for the right of agnostics and people without religious belief in countries where it's imposed on them that you have to be religious, like Saudi Arabia and some other Islamic extremist countries. So culturally, Russia and the USA are much closer to European values than that. Is there evidence of Israeli interference in those elections? Is this something Mossad would have benefited from? The mind boggles, you know. I hope not. I haven't got a clue. I've been to Israel many times. I'm chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. And I'm trying to get Israelis and Palestinians to talk peace and work out a friendly and sustainable two-state solution, and you know, for other countries in the Middle East to join them in that. You know, one reads stories that Israel has these teams of young hackers all doing computer warfare games. Well, I would be shocked, deeply, deeply disturbed to think that they've been interfering in these Brexit referenda, and they certainly have the intelligence to do it because they write a lot of the software that runs all these kind of programs. I don't think it's feasible, but I think they might have thought, well, that'll be great, you know, we can destabilise Europe, because Israeli and European Union relations haven't been all that great, because the European Union has put on the line the fact it wants a two-state solution, it wants a Palestine state. It helped fund the Palestine airport in Gaza, which was then destroyed by Israeli tanks. And so there are some diplomatic problems between the European Union and Israel, largely over the non-recognition of the rights of Palestinians. And I'm afraid I'm with the European Union on that. At the same time, of course, what people in Gaza and so on need to do is stop any violence at all. They need to stop their rockets. And when I was in Israel last, that was a matter of huge concern. And the European Union could be a mediation tool for diplomacy, for peacemaking. And I think the problem with Netanyahu's government, which is under review, the people of Israel have got a chance now to vote it down. Tomorrow, I think the elections are, or this week certainly. Netanyahu has 100% refused to have any discussions with the Palestinians and to just recognise them at all. His father was a historian and a scholar of considerable repute who wrote a book on the history of the Inquisition in Spain. Netanyahu's dad hated anybody that didn't, you know, love the Jews, because he knew about how much they'd been persecuted. The Inquisition in Spain was not only attacking, it began by attacking Cathars, Gnostics, and esoteric Christians, but then it went on to ferret out people that were partly Jewish or that had Jewish leanings. You know, might be crypto-Kabbalists or something. I'd definitely been burned by that Spanish Inquisition, because I'm a great, you know, lover of the Kabbalah, and I'm an ecumenical cosmic thinker like Plethon or John Dee or Guillaume Postel, these figures that inspire my work as a peace philosopher. So, yeah, I respect old man Netanyahu, but young boy Netanyahu is trying to outdo dad. You know, wherever he looks, he sees enemies out to get Israel, and he's gone to a place of total paranoia that is very disturbing for a world leader. His speech at the UN General Assembly in September was disgraceful. He was like accusing every other state of being anti-Semitic. Hang on, you know, the whole category of Semitic versus non-Semitic is intellectually bogus. It's a product of 19th century racial categorization in history, which is not scientifically backed up, as many great scientists have now said. And it's also demonstrably proven, I think, that the Indo-European and Hamitic-Semitic peoples are ultimately one race. We go back to one commonality, as I've indicated in my book, The Kabbalah Runes, showing that the Kabbalah and the runes go back to one system. So, you know, anyway, Netanyahu is in the paranoid ranks of people. And unfortunately, you see, people that are afraid and have been victimised, and a lot of the Israelis who vote for him lost relatives in the Holocaust and so on. So they identify with a strong leader. And as Ernst Becker points out in his book, The Denial of Death, They kind of get a kick off transference onto the charismatic leader. But he is actually a criminal. You know, he's done criminal things. So, is it possible that he would have authorised Israeli intelligence to interfere in the 1916 referendum because he, for his thought, I don't know what, decided that that'll really destroy the EU, will really stick a knife into it? And, well, I don't know. Discuss, suspend judgment, work with historians that know these things, find the evidence, look for the trail. It is possible, and it's a working hypothesis, just as it is with Russia and American interference. What about Saudi Arabian interference? Another possible. Is that possible? Well, I think yes, it is. Again, if it's the other ones are possible, so is Saudi Arabian interference. But hang on, isn't Saudi Arabia sort of ally? Why would they want to break up the European Union? Well, you need to know a little bit about international politics and what's going on behind the scenes. There is a case of a boy in Saudi Arabia, Raif Badawi, who tried to found a group called Saudi Arabian Liberals, and he campaigned for the right of agnostics and people to think. Like we do, we take for granted the right to think. Our society is a liberal society in Britain and the West and Europe, and we can question and discuss, and I'm not going to be hauled off and tortured for talking like this. In Saudi Arabia, that's not the case, and this he was then a boy, he's now a young man. By founding this Saudi Arabian liberal society, for freedom of discussion, they would meet in cafes and debate things like the death penalty. And in Saudi Arabia, to say that you don't believe in God is actually a criminal offence, and it leads to severe persecution. Just think about that. Like, you don't have the freedom to think about the nature of God. It's compulsory to believe in God. And if you say on social media, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, you're actually breaking the law. Well, Badawi and a group of his friends, a few hundred of them, felt this is wrong, and so they campaigned strenuously to change the law. And he was, a blogger and all that. Anyway, after a few months of this, he was arrested and put in prison and sentenced. And then he was sentenced to, I think it's 1,000 lashes and a fine of about $200,000. Vast punishment for simply wanting to be a liberal. You see, I'm a liberal intellectually, and I'm a Canadian liberal initially, and I support the project of liberal democracy in Europe. I support it because we learned that when Socrates was killed by the Athenian illiberal government of the day, it was a blow against freedom of thought. I'm an academic. I follow in the footsteps of Plato, who was Socrates' disciple, who founded the first academy, saying, this is an institution where we can feel free to think. Why is it good to feel free to think? Because that way we might get truth. Philosophy starts from the assumption that freedom of thought is the best guarantor ultimately of truth. You see, if you force views on somebody and you enforce them with torture, you're going to get everybody saying, yes, I believe, but actually they probably don't, because you force them to with torture. That's not truth. You're going to get an illiberal state in which everybody's terrified. That's what Nazi Germany was. That's what the Soviet Union became under Stalin. That's what, tragically, Goebbels and co were all doing in Nazi Germany. And it's what Saudi Arabia is kind of trying to do, and mistakenly, because that's not what Muhammad wanted. That's not true Islam at all. And in my commentary on the Quran, you'll see, if you listen to it in detail, that the Quran is actually an amazing peace text if it's properly understood and comprehended. These people that are using it as a guide to torturing are criminals, actually. These are the heretics. I don't know if you know this, but the Wahhabi sect of Islam is actually a heresy, and it was known as such when the British were in India. There were Wahhabis in the hills of the northwest frontier that we had to fight because they were fanatics. They were doing Wahhabi stuff, agitating, and they were fighting the British. And the British were not idiots. They said these people are dangerous because of their fanatical interpretation of Islam, which says that everybody who doesn't do it our way is a devil worshipper, and we have the right to kill them. Well, I don't take that view. You know, the liberal position I come from is we have a duty to sit down and have conversations with each other as human beings. It's a form of humanism, right? Anyway, this poor chap Badawi was then arrested. He's been lashed. They've discovered that he can't withstand 1,000 lashes in one go. He's only a young chap. He's very skinny. He's got diabetes. He'll die. So they're lashing him 50 times every week up to now. Every week he's getting 50 lashes, which, I mean, can you imagine? I mean, I don't like physical torture and pain. I mean, when I have a toothache, it's horrible. But can you imagine 50 whiplashes every week? I mean, this poor chap, right? And his wife had to flee from Saudi Arabia to go to Canada, where she's now, taken refuge. Bless the Canadians. And the European Union has made protests to the Saudis over this. Even the British government, Philip Hammond, as when he was foreign minister, he protested to the Saudis, bless him. He seems one of the more liberal members of Theresa May's cabinet. Interestingly enough, he's also calling for a second referendum. The Canadian government protested. Again, just said, let this boy go. He can come and live in Canada. But no, the Saudis are keeping him in prison, whipping him, and they've now captured his sister, who was trying to be supportive. Anyway, what's this got to do with Brexit? Well, the Saudis really don't like liberalism. They hate it because they're unintelligent. They haven't thought these things through. They've never studied philosophy. They are mono-trained in their own Wahhabi indoctrination camps. No philosophy is allowed in schools in Saudi Arabia, which, as a philosophy teacher in schools in Britain, I find shocking. They won't let these kids learn to think. And so, basically, the Swedish Foreign Minister, Margaret Wallström, protested to the Saudi government on behalf of the European Union. And the Saudis have been trying to destabilise the European Union ever since. There is a diplomatic war behind the scenes going on between the European Union and the Saudi regime. And its fulcrum, its spark point, seems to have been the case of this boy who was being tortured in a Saudi prison. The Canadian government has been involved because we, as Canadians, I'm a Canadian dual citizen, also protested. And you know what the Saudi response was to withdraw their ambassador from Canada. They're now at war with Canada and have been making ridiculous attacks on Canada. Now, how do they get away with this? Why don't we just laugh it off? Well, it's their vast monetary wealth. You see, the Saudis can literally buy countries, let alone buy half of London or whatever. Because they have all this wealth, they're able to misuse it and corrupt the political systems of democratic regimes. And this is what's very worrying about Brexit, because it looks to me as if it's possible that Saudi intelligence did indeed play a role in swinging the Brexit vote in order to destabilise the European Union, because Allah wills it, because God is on the side of the righteous against Europe, because it's a cesspit of liberalism. And God, women are allowed to walk down the street, in miniskirts, and people are allowed to hold hands in the streets of Paris and sit on a park bench and share a kiss, all of which are outlawed in Saudi Arabia and its satellite states. And what Saudi Arabia is now doing, attacking the Shia country of Yemen with bombs supplied by Philip May and the government of Theresa May and the Americans, is part of this same pattern. And it's called the illiberalisation of modernity. And I see the Brexit campaign as part of that illiberalisation. And if it was funded partly by Saudi money, and then I think that is a scandal for British culture. And and Europe as a whole, and scholars should explore this and research it and expose it if it's true. I suspend judgment again. I put all this in brackets. There is evidence that this is the case. And there is also evidence that the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, received a very large sum of money during the referendum campaign, and they promoted Brexit with this money, whose source has never been declared, and it appears to be Saudi money. So the DUP, which is the least liberal of all the political parties in Northern Ireland, it's against, all the things that the Saudis don't like, seems to have accepted their money to run an anti-Brexit campaign. Again, the British people have the right to know, because this is foreign interference with a very, very important key referendum that was made on our territory by us, the British people. And if the illegal victory was won with aid, money and intelligence from the Saudis, we have an absolute right and duty to find out if that's the case. And I don't care how wealthy they are or how much money they've got. Truth, justice and honour demand that these facts be revealed. But you might say, no, surely they wouldn't do that. They can't be that evil. But look at what just happened to that in the Turkish embassy of Saudi Arabia, when it turns out a naive Khashoggi went. Poor man was in love. He wanted a visa to be able to marry his sweetheart, a Turkish woman he'd fallen in love with. And the response of these Saudi officials was to literally kill him and cut him into pieces. I mean, how despicable and cruel and off the track of what is acceptable diplomacy or anything. It breaks every single rule of ethics in my book and in the entire canon of religious and theological, rule books. And yet that's what they did. And it was sanctioned by the guy who's taken over Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. King Salman should sack that guy, in my opinion. I've said this before, and it's shocking. And yet what does America do? In the form of Trump, it says, no problem, mate. Do what you want, cut up who you want, you're our friends. Well, I'm sorry, Europe has been saying, no, that's not acceptable. If you look at what Germany responded and what the European Union has said, is that, no, we stand for certain values in the world. We won't accept cutting up of journalists. It's not on. And I would say I won't accept cutting up of countries, because I believe Brexit is going to cut up the UK, and I think it's come from the same stable, discuss, look at the evidence, partly as the cutting up people behind Khashoggi. I'm simply as a scholar, I'm saying this isn't acceptable. As a historian, we need to find this out. And, liberalism is based on truth. Gladstone was a great scholar. He founded the great library in North Wales, which I've organised a conference on the history of 9/11 once, at Harden. And Gladstone was someone who loved the classics. He studied Homer, and he wanted to understand the truth behind Homer's stories. I'm a great lover of Homer. He was a friend of Schliemann, who found the seat of Troy. I'm with Gladstone on this. I want truth. And I'm someone that believes the British people, deep down, would be shocked if all this came out. So what lawyers and legal attempts have been made to oppose the results of the Brexit referendum and try to get it challenged in courts? There's a list of them, As part of the work of this Centre for Opposition to Brexit Studies, we need to, list them all, look at the court cases, look at the evidence, find out who brought these cases and what the legal rulings were, and to find out who, if any, are still planning to challenge it. I believe it will be possibly in the courts that this matter will be settled eventually, and that result will be declared illegal.